Two stories. Both are true. Story number one, Alexander M. Sanders, former chief judge of the South Carolina Court of Appeals, shared this story about his daughter Zoe to the graduating class of the University of South Carolina several years ago. His daughter was a member of the class. These were his words. When Zoe was 3 years old, I came home from work to find a crisis in my household. Zoe's pet turtle had died, and she was crying as if her heart would break. Her mother, having coped with the problems of the home all day, turned that one over to me to solve. At the time, I was practicing law and serving in the legislature. Frankly, it was a problem a lawyer-politician was not up to solving. The mysteries of life and death are difficult, if not impossible, for the mature mind to fathom. The task of explaining them to a 3-year-old was completely beyond either my confidence or experience, but I tried. First, I made the obvious argument that we would get another turtle to replace the one that had died. We'd go down to the pet store, buy another one just like the one who was gone. I got nowhere with that argument. Even at 3 years old, Zoe was smart enough to know that there is a certain non-transferability about living things. A turtle is not a toy. There's really no such thing as getting another one just like the one who had died. Zoe's tears continued. Finally, in desperation, I said, I'll tell you what, we'll have a funeral for the turtle. Well, being 3 years old, she didn't know what a funeral was, so I quickly proceeded to expand on my theme. You see, I was employing the typical lawyer's tactic of diversion. If you can't win on the issue at hand, take off on something completely beside the point. A funeral, I explained, is a great festival in honor of the turtle. Well, she didn't know what a festival was either. So I quickly proceeded to explain further, and as I did so, I began to depart from the lawyer's tactic of diversion and engage in the politician's prerogative of outright lying. Actually, I said, a funeral is like a birthday party. We'll have ice cream and cake and lemonade and balloons, and all the children in the neighborhood will come over to the house to play. All because the turtle has died. Success at last. Her tears began to dry, and she quickly returned to her happy, smiling self again. Now happy, now joyous, at the prospect of all that was going to happen, all because the turtle had died. Then an utterly unforeseen thing happened. We looked down, and lo and behold, the turtle began to move. He was not dead after all. In a matter of seconds, he was crawling away as lively as ever. For once, a politician was struck dumb for words. I just did not know what to say, but Zoe appraised the situation perfectly. And although this happened many years ago, I remember what she said as though it was yesterday. With all the innocence of her tender years, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, let's kill it." We can forgive Zoe's childhood innocence. She now practices law alongside her father in his South Carolina firm. We imagine that her understanding of life and death today is far more sophisticated and compassionate. The second story is one in which I was personally involved very early in my rabbinic career. The story begins with a phone call. Phone rang. I picked up the receiver. This was long before the smartphone age, when phones had receivers. "Rabbi, it's Scott from Benjamin's." I knew already that he was not calling about a wedding. "Yes, Scott?" "Rabbi, can you do a service for us tomorrow? A Sarah Greenstein, not her real name, passed away, and the family has no rabbi." I agreed to do the service. Later that day, the family came in to see me. Ms. Greenstein had never married, was survived by an elderly brother and sister. They were both very pleasant, but hard of hearing. We talked, I asked questions. In fact, the meeting was not at all unusual. They left, I prepared my eulogy notes for the next day's funeral, went about my business. Later that evening at home, the phone rang. The conversation went something like this. Hello? Rabbi? Yes? Rabbi, it's Scott from Benjamin's. Yes, Scott, you're calling to confirm the Greenstein service for tomorrow? Well, Rabbi, not exactly. There's a problem with the service. What's the problem? She's not dead. I asked them, does that mean there's no funeral? There's more to the story. But suffice it to say, the family misunderstood a message from the nursing home and erroneously concluded that Ms. Greenstein had died. It was only after the family completed all the arrangements that the chapel discovered that it was all a mistake. Sarah Greenstein was very much alive. I asked the funeral director, so tell me, how did the family react to the new development? Did they jump up and down with joy? Did they shed tears of thanksgiving at the news that their sister was in fact alive, that it had all been a mistake? Evidently, they were not so happy. Beyond the initial shock, their reaction included dismay that preparations had been made. Dozens of eggs were now hard-boiled for nothing. They were, it seems, all set for a funeral, and now a little put off that their plans were suddenly turned around. Ms. Greenstein's siblings, whose sister was in fact alive, were not prepared for good news. And to be sure, sudden reversals of fortune are often very difficult to accept. We don't always do happiness well. Today, liturgically, as you've seen, is a very busy Shabbat. We read a double Parashat, concluding Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. We recited a Hallel. We will, in a short while, daven a Musaf service especially curated for Shabbat Rosh Chodesh. Yes, it's a busy Shabbat. But also noteworthy is what our sages say about the new month that we have entered today, the month of Av. The Mishnah, in 4 words, heralds a mood change effective as Av begins. Mishe nichnas Av mima'atin b'simcha. When Av begins, we minimalize our joy. We've already begun to lessen our celebration 2 weeks ago on the 17th of Tammuz, when the 3 weeks of remembering the ancient destructions of the Beth HaMikdash and Jerusalem began. Weddings traditionally don't happen during these 3 weeks, and public celebratory gatherings of all kinds are discouraged. All this intensifies as of today, during the first 9 days of Av, when, except for Shabbat, meat and wine, signs of celebration, traditionally are avoided. In the Talmud's discussion of the Mishnah's comment that Michshenichnas Av Mimatin B'Simcha, that when Av begins, joy is minimized, Rav Yehuda offers a profoundly significant addition. It's almost in the fine print of text. It's not in the Mishnah, which is the major legal source. It's in a comment on the Mishnah. And Rav Yehuda adds the words that just as we diminish our joy when Av begins, so too remember something. Misha nichnas adar marbim b'simcha. When Adar begins, we magnify our joy. This is not something we'd expect to confront in Tractate Ta'anit, a rather somber tractate devoted, as its title indicates, to fasting. Why bring up joy when the subject matter is mourning, tribulation, grief, and sorrow? Perhaps because Rav Yehuda understood our tendency too often to fixate on the negative, the dark and dreary side of life, of our history, not allowing sufficient space or energy for happiness, for fun, for celebration. So Rav Yehuda places a condition on our mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, we can mourn the tragedies of the past, but only on condition that we commit to celebrate our successes, our survival, our continuation as a people that contributes disproportionately to our numbers, to the well-being of humanity. You remember the story of Joseph and his brothers, how toward the end of the story in Genesis, his brothers return from Egypt and tell their father Yaakov, Joseph is alive, and guess what? He's the ruler of all Egypt. Imagine Jacob, who had been misled by his other sons into believing that Joseph was mauled to death by a beast, now finds out that he's alive, that he's well, that he's a hero, that he's a celebrity. Remember how deep his sorrow was years earlier when he was told that Joseph had died? What did he do then? Vayikra Yaakov simlo tafi, tore his garments, he put on sackcloth, he mourned for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him. Vayima'en lehitnachem, he refused all consolation. He said, I will mourn until I join my son in the grave. In other words, my mourning is going to continue forever. But what happens now years later in that Jacob is told that Joseph is alive? First the Torah tells us he's taken aback, he doesn't believe it, and then as the news begins to sink in, he says, he's alive, I got to visit him before I die. So he's brought to Egypt, an emotional encounter with Joseph, he's introduced to the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks him a rather straightforward question. How old are you? And his answer is strange. He says, I'm 130 years old. The years of my life have been few and miserable. Is this the same happy man who was just reunited after so many years with the son he thought was dead? Why is he so bitter? Can't he forget the pain of the past in the jubilation of the moment? What's wrong with him? As wonderful as the dramatic news of the moment may be, the suddenness of the change was traumatic. So many years of sorrow, it was hard to shift course. Adjustment is necessary. It's not always quick. It sometimes takes time to get over the loss. I'm reminded of the sketch in the legendary 1965 record, You Don't Have to Be Jewish. Many of us are old enough to remember that recording when it came out 60 years ago. And there's a scene, unforgettable scene in that recording. An elderly Jew from the Alta Haim, from the old world, cries out, Oi, am I thirsty? Some of you remember it. Oi, am I thirsty? And after being offered a glass of water, he drinks, and then he says, Oi, was I thirsty? The pain of the past is sometimes hard to separate from. That was Jacob's misfortune. Robert Alter described his life as a story with a happy ending that withholds any simple feeling of happiness at the end. So why do we Jews struggle so much with happiness? Why are we still fixated on our thirst even after it's been quenched? Are we like Jacob, unable to celebrate his son's survival, his son's triumph, because he still lives in the pain of his past? We've all seen examples of those who endured terrible hardships in their early years, and some of you present today remember those hardships and lived them. Among them, survivors of the Shoah, and those who are on these shores but may have suffered less than their fellow Jews in Europe, but nonetheless struggled terribly during the Depression years. We've seen examples of many who grew up in those challenging times, who later achieved great success, were able to meet all their needs and then some, but who would still hoard food, take home rolls from the restaurant breadbasket, because of that deeply internalized childhood memory of hunger and deprivation. Those of us fortunate enough to have been raised in better times would reference this as the Depression mentality, sometimes in too dismissive a fashion. But the inability to escape the pain of our past, such as that experienced by Jacob, who became Israel, whose name we as a people bear, that inability is real, with solid foundation in the pages of our long and difficult history. Truth be told, as a people, we do pessimism well. Historian Simon Ravodovich notes the world makes many images of Israel, but Israel makes only one image of itself, that of being constantly on the urge of ceasing to be, of disappearing. There was hardly a generation of the diaspora period that did not consider itself to be the final link in Israel's chain. Rabbi David offers several examples of this internalized pessimism, one of which comes from the pen of the Zionist writer and poet of the late 19th century, Yud Lamed Gordon, who wrote, "For whom do I labor? Who shall tell me their future? Who will tell me that I am not the last poet of Zion? And you, my last readers." But as Gordon was mourning the death of Hebrew poetry, at that very time, a young man was making his way through the yeshiva of Volozhin. You may have heard of him, Chaim Nachman Bialik. And in Odessa, at the same time, in a Russian secondary school, a student by the name of Shaul Chernyakhovsky and dozens of other future poetic geniuses after them, they were making their impact. It's true, to be sure, we've undergone some really dark moments in history. No doubt our fear for future was reality-based more than once in history. But it's not by chance that we've endured. With our powerful and meaningful traditions and practices, and through our own hard-learned resilience and our dedication to the values of freedom and human dignity, we've made it to this moment heads held up high. So how do we as a people find that measure of happiness, of self-assuredness, to enable optimism and hope to overcome darkness and fear? And it's not even fair to ask that question today. And is it even fair to ask that question today when we, of course, are not problem-free? As anti-Semitism has far from vanished from our midst, rather has risen to levels not seen in the lifetime of so many of us, as Israel haters are anything but silent, most especially in these last 2 very painful years, how do we dare to be optimistic? So you ask, are you expecting us to be optimistic in the face of all this tsuris? Is not optimism, with all the issues we are confronting, both internal and external, shorthand for insanity? Perhaps yes. Maybe it's borderline insanity for Jews living today to be optimistic about our future. But look, that we are still here today, notwithstanding all the predictions of our demise, does open the door for a significant measure of optimism and hope. The spirit of both Av and Adar were captured together in a short prayer composed by a boy named Shmuel. We only know his first name. A boy named Shmuel, which he recited not long after the death camps were liberated at his bar mitzvah. Shmuel and his sister survived, their parents did not. These were his words. Ich bet, was der Taten und die Mama schon herunter von Himmel und sehen, als ihr Sohn wird bar mitzvah heint. I pray that my mother and father may look down from heaven and see that their son is bar mitzvah today. And may they know that my sister and I, sein geblieben gute Yidden, we've remained good Jews, and we will always remain so. And so as we enter the month of Av, let's not try not only to focus on the Mishnah's injunction of diminishing our joy, but even more to remember Rav Yehuda's Adar addendum of Marbim B'Simcha, of a refusal to relinquish joy and hope. For as long as we reaffirm, as did the young Shmuel, that our connection with our peoplehood, our heritage, will forever be part of us, then to be sure we can face the months and years ahead with optimism, with hope, and with courage. Can you hear what's on?